that looked at a couple of specific issues. So the first one was around the augmentation of drinking water supplies, or what we would know as potable reuse. There was a guideline document produced on managed aquifer recharge, and also one on stormwater reuse. Many people on this call may remember that it was actually Malcolm Turnbull, when he was the Federal Water Minister, who initiated this project, again in response to what appeared to be, well, in the middle of the millennium drought. The other thing to note is obviously these documents are a little bit long in the tooth now, and one of the things that's happening is the phase 1 document is going through what has been a bit of a long-term review process, and I guess we're all hoping that we might see a revised version of that sometime later this year. So as many people would know, the risk framework that was adopted in the Australian Guidelines for Water Recycling was identical to that was included in the 2004 version of the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines. So pretty much that 12-element framework around having that commitment to the responsible use and management of recycled water, then a range of system analysis and management actions, supporting requirements, and a review function. But the other thing to note, just like ADWG, the Australian Guidelines for Water Recycling were set up as national guidance documents. So that is, the states and territories could adopt the AGWR to their specific regulatory frameworks, which I guess doesn't always help for aligned national implementation. One of the main differences between the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines and the Guidelines for Water Recycling is that the Recycling Water Guidelines included microbial health-based targets. And then, of course, if you have defined microbial health-based targets, then that sets up the need to define pathogen log reduction values for treatment trains, depending on the end use. And then if you're going to have defined LRVs, then you need to demonstrate or have a validation process to demonstrate that those LRVs can be achieved or are being achieved through that treatment train. And the table on the left-hand side of the screen is taken from the 2006 version of AGWR, and that's one of the tables that's in the process of being updated for current information that's come to light since that point of time. And Chu, in a later presentation, will give you a great practical example of how you go and apply these guidelines to a real-world scheme. So as mentioned previously, there is a range of state-based guidance material. This one here shown on the left of the screen is the Victorian Guidelines for Water Recycling. The updated version was released last year. Unfortunately, each state and territory has a slightly different set of these guidelines and associated regulatory frameworks. And I guess if you're looking at it from a scheme proponent's perspective or a manufacturer of technology, this can lead to certain levels of inefficiency, as validation requirements may also vary from state to state, which means you may have to go through multiple validation processes. In 2007, we had a change of federal government, and obviously the millennial drought was still going on at that point in time. So at that stage, the Labor Commonwealth government funded a number of water-related centres of excellence. The one relevant to today's discussion was the Australian Water Recycling Centre of Excellence, or the AWR COE, and that was funded to look at all aspects of water recycling, and that ran from 2009 to 2016. Because it started in 2009, obviously the millennial drought broke in 2010-11, which I guess took a little bit of heat out of the recycling water industry. But anyway, having said that, one of the flagship programs of the Centre of Excellence was NatVal, or a National Validation Framework. And NatVal's main aim was to create a university agreed validation framework for treatment technologies that utilise in water recycling, and then possibly by extension other water treatment types, including those used in drinking water. And the idea was that if you had that unified university agreed framework, that would streamline the validation process across Australia, because really, if you're running a UV system in Queensland, it probably hasn't got a lot of difference if you're running it in Western Australia, for example. When the Centre of Excellence finished up in 2016, unfortunately, NatVal wasn't quite completed at that point in time. NatVal IP was transferred to an entity known as WaterSecure, and NatVal became what a lot of people would know now as Watervale. WaterSecure, in its tenure, managed to finish and publish a number of validation protocols, but for a range of reasons, WaterSecure was wound up in 2018, and the Watervale IP transferred to WaterRA, and Jacqueline will be covering this in a lot more detail in her presentation. And that's where I'm going to stop, Mark, because I guess a lot of the other presentations will dovetail into that fairly brief introduction to the topic of validation.
Okay, terrific. Thanks for all of that, Peter. David, sorry. So questions, shoot them on the chat line, and we'll be ready to go. I see Chu has successfully got his presentation up. So Chu is Stantec's water reuse practice manager lead in Australia. He's a practicing engineer with over 20 years experience in wastewater treatment and water recycling. He's based in Sydney and currently serves as the treatment design lead for Sydney's Sydney Water's West Region delivery team. So over to Chu. Yep, all yours.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Mark. Good afternoon, everyone. So today I'll be sharing with you the journey that we took for the Googong water recycling project. So I noticed that in the audience, there's a number of you who actually been involved in the project. So yeah, please reserve your question near the end. So Googong is a town that's located in New South Wales. So it's a new town that was actually conceptualized, planned, and seeking planning approval during the millennium drought. So for those of you who doesn't know about the project or the project locations, the new town of Googong is located very close to Canberra. So if you go to the Canberra airport, it is only about 10 kilometers from there. So for those of us living in New South Wales, it is on the way to the Snowy Mountain. And if you take the old Cooma Road, you actually will see the town on the left-hand side as you drive down towards the Snowy Mountain. So because it's a new town and it was conceived in the millennium drought, water security or resiliency is a very important part for the planning approval. So the next slide, I'll talk about the project timeline. So the whole project approval was submitted during the millennium drought, which is in the 2000s. And the planning approval was actually granted in 2010. So there's a couple of timelines. I kind of put it at the high level, just on the yearly level. So once the project approval was granted, the developer for the parcel of land actually went about trying to implement the whole project. And a key part of the project is to have a water recycling plant that will recycle the water, the wastewater in the whole collector in the township, and then treat it, and then resupply it via a purple pipe around the whole neighborhood. So a key part of the strategy is to try to select pre-validated membrane supplier or the technology supplier as part of the water recycling plant construction. So in 2013, there was competitive tenders sent out to try to select the MBR membrane and the UV technology that will form key part of the validation for the recycled water scheme. In parallel, the construction contract was being tendered, and in late 2013, the whole contract was being awarded. Very quickly in 2014, first residents moved into the town. Unfortunately, we can't really commission the plant until there's a certain amount of population. So construction of the plant was completed in 2015, and then commissioning of the plant also completed in late 2015. We went through a very extensive 6 months process verification period or proving period. So in the middle of 2016, the whole plant went into operations. Okay, but it took another 4 years for the whole recycled water to be supplied to the town. There's a number of reasons for that, not necessarily related to validations, but it is a long process that took quite a period of time to implement this project. So as I mentioned before, Gugon is a georetic township. Recycled water is being supplied in a purple pipe to each of the household. So I think David mentioned about AGWR. So if you go through the AGWR, the pathogen log reduction requirement for a georetic scheme are summarized in the couple of bullets here. So for virus, it's a 6.5 log. Protozoa is about 5.5 log. Bacteria is about 5.2 log. So for Gugon, we employ a multi-barrier approach to trying to achieve these log reduction targets. So there's a combination of MBR, UV, and chlorine to trying to achieve a total log reduction, which is way exceeding the required log reduction. So if we just go through each of the barrier, MBR, we are targeting to trying to achieve 2 log, with UV supplying a further 1 log reduction. Chlorine disinfection systems was designed to achieve a 4 log reduction of the virus. Now, if you use that similar technology, what you find is that the protozoa and the bacteria log reduction will be about 7 and 11, and that way exceed the 5.5 or 5.2 logs required for the scheme. Okay, so as I mentioned before, the validation approach, we taken the approach of trying to employ validated product, and the whole idea is we're trying to have validated product that also have online indicator that could continuously monitor the effectiveness of the barrier. A key thing to consider here is really the procurement approach. We know the whole thing will be constructed by a civil contractor, but the key thing is that we want to own the control of the validated technology that will be implemented for the project. So like I mentioned before, the MBR membrane package was competitively selected, and we evaluate the validation status for the membrane in order to reach the selection. Same for the UV reactor, we evaluate the validation status for the reactor, and then select the technology before nominating the product to the main contractor for the project. It's worth also noting that we also put in a backup barrier. As part of the design, we have tertiary filtration membrane to achieve a tertiary phosphorus removal, and that was designed to be a backup barrier because around 2012, 2013, there are some doubts about whether MBR can be considered as a validated technology for water recycling. So we deliberately consider to have another cell membrane just as a backup barrier. Now the last part is chlorinations. Unfortunately, you can't really achieve pre-validated status for chlorinations. It's a purpose-built system. So a key part of the chlorination validation is to try to conduct the tracer study as part of commissioning, and that was specified as part of the specification requirement for the main contractor. So the next couple of slides, I will briefly talk about the validations for each of the technology. So the picture that is shown in these photos is the MBR membrane that was freshly installed for this project. So as part of the tender evaluations, we look at the validation status, and the selected membrane has been challenge tested per the US EPA guideline, the membrane filtration guidance manual, published in 2005. And as part of that challenge testing, the virus was seeded, which is MS2 bacteriophage as an indicator, and they measure the number of log reductions being achieved across the membrane. So with an integrated membrane, more than 2.6 logs of the virus was rejected, and then a carbon fiber test was conducted to measure what is the effect of carbon fiber on the log reduction. So I think for a module, they measure up to about two or three carbon fibers, and they still achieve more than 2.4 logs of the virus reduction. So as a result, we adopted 2-log virus reduction to be claimed based on the MBR membrane. And as part of the critical control point, the filtrate turbidity was selected to demonstrate continuous performance of the MBR membrane. So the next technology is the UV reactor. So the UV reactor was selected based on their pre-validation status. So for this UV reactor, it was challenge tested in US by Colorado engineers using the UV DGM, again published by US EPA. A key part of the implementation is to look at the installation of the UV reactor. So as part of the tender bidding for the UV, we asked the supplier to submit the validated arrangement for the UV reactor. And importantly, we need to replicate that validated arrangement as part of the overall project implementation. So as you can see in these photos, there is a number of linear length requirement for the pipe to enter the UV reactor, and that's used to achieve laminar flow of the flow pattern before the water enter the UV reactor and then exiting the UV reactor. So the critical control point for this UV systems, including the flow, which control the residence time, the UVT, as well as the reduction equivalent dose. Now, the last technology that was implemented for Gugon to try to achieve the log reduction barrier is the chlorine disinfection. So this is an area view of the water recycling plants. So if you follow the green box, what we have employed here is a chlorine contact pipe, which is a GRP pipe that was buried under the ground. Okay, so the hypo was being dosed at the end of the UV shed, which is the structure over here, and from there the chlorinated water will flow towards the recycled water storage tank, and then we measure the residual chlorine at the end of the pipe just before you enter the tank. So with this pipe arrangement, we're achieving an aspect ratio of about 90:1, which is, in my opinion, as serpentine as you can get in a chlorine disinfection system. So the critical control point for this chlorine disinfection system is trying to achieve a CT value of 16 milligram per minutes per liters, under the condition that the water temperature will be above 10 degrees and the pH is less than 8. Okay. Now, in order to validate the design, a key part of it is to conduct a tracer studies. So the tracer study was conducted by Yabi Pond. I think Zelko is here today as part of the meeting. The challenge testing was conducted using a dye, which is rhodamine WT, and the concept is based on the T10 concept. So the T10 concept was proposed by the US EPA for profiling studies, and the idea is to try to detect the time it takes for 10% of the tracer dose that was measured in the chlorine residual monitoring point. And that T10 measure is then compared to the theoretical detention time of the pipe to calculate the buffer factor. So if you have 100% efficient chlorine disinfection system, you should get a buffer factor of 1. But in reality, in real life, no systems can actually achieve 1. So based on we conducted a couple of tracer studies for this project, and there's about 4 runs being conducted. And the last column there, which is shaded in green, show you the efficiency factor that we can achieve with this chlorine contact pipe design. So the numbers range between 85% all the way to about 92%. The next slide. I'll show you a typical response coming out from the tracer studies. So in this slide, what the tracer response, which is slug dose at time 0, is being plotted at the end of the pipe where we measure the dose. So the time it takes to, and then the time scale is being normalized against the theoretical detention time. So the monitoring was conducted up to about 1.7, 1.8 of the theoretical contact time. And during that period, more than 90% of the tracers was being collected as part of the tracer response test. So if you plot it and then estimate the time it takes for 10% of the tracers to come out, in this particular case, you get an efficiency factor of about 0.89. Okay, so all this number would then employ to calculate the CT value in the SCADA program and then form the CCP for the project. So on top of all this validation study, the project also conducted verification testing, and this was conducted during the commissioning and the process proving phase. And this was done in consultation with Office Water at the time, and it measured a number of indicator organisms at different part of the process. So for the MBR, we measure the MBR filtrates, and for the UV, we measure the water after the UV reactor, and then finally for the chlorination system, the recycled water that we measure will demonstrate the level of indicator organisms in the water. So a number of indicators organism was selected. So for virus is somatic coliphage, protozoa is Clostridium perfringens, and bacteria is fecal and total coliform. And basically based on the verification testing, we are not able to detect any of the indicator species in pretty much all the samples. And with that verification testing together with the validation that was conducted, the scheme passed its validation requirement for the project. So the validation journey is also conducted together with other part of the recycled water management plan, that including a public education program across the town. And also there's a number of cross-connection check that was conducted for the household, leading to the recycled water being approved to be supplied to the town in the year of 2020. Now, in internal outcome, I think what this project demonstrates that if you can conduct the validations properly for a project like this, it could really improve the resiliency and the livelihood of a new town, which is located inland. Usually for all these inland towns, desalination is really no option. And recycling is a key part to trying to improve the water security and the water resiliency of the town. So today, Gugong is a home to about 2,500 people, and ultimately it will be home to about some 6,000 people in the next couple of years, up to 10 years. That's all I have for the presentations. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, thanks, Stu. That was fantastic. Now, just to remind everybody, I seem to have an just a moment while I.
Can I check?
Okay, that should be all right.
Sharing. I stopped sharing.
Yeah, stop sharing.
Okay, cool.
All right, and we're going to get Jacqueline to share her screen while she's setting up. We'll do a brief bio on her. Marty Hancock was going to be talking or doing this presentation today. Unfortunately, he has some medical issues at the moment and can't come along, but Jacqueline has kindly stepped up for us. So Jacqueline is Water Research Australia's General Manager for Research Services. She's a water resources engineer and hydrologist by training that has been in the water sector and water business for over 25 years. Her career path is marked from a research assistant in Germany and American universities, consulting with CH2M Hill in the USA for 10 years, followed by being employed in South Australia since 2002 with South Australian EPA, SA Water and Water RA. Solving challenges in the water sector and water issues ensures the broader community benefits remain at the front and centre of her work. During her career, she has led project teams on climate, water, wastewater, and environmental management, as well as water and wastewater research. She is currently managing the research team at Water RA and has a broad spectrum of industry-driven research. So I see Jacqueline has her screen up and ready to roll. So I will happily hand over to her.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for the introduction. I presume you can see my slideshow, as I heard. So this presentation is about the future of Watervale, and you heard from David Sheen some of the history. So I'll brush over the history very quickly and then get into the future and what we have done since it was handed over to Water RA, and answering the question, why has it taken so long? So let's see if I can do that. So this is just a little brush over. So as you have heard, the Australian Water Recycling Centre of Excellence kind of concluded in 2016, went over to Water Secure in 2018. It was handed over to Water RA. And so we have taken it over from there on and trying to get it up and running in its new form. So as you may know, available Watervale protocols to date include already reverse osmosis and nanofiltration, chlorination, membrane bioreactors, ozone disinfection, and ultraviolet disinfection. So it is interesting to hear from Chu that, you know, some of the issues that we are sometimes encountering is which processes do we employ and what kind of validation do we use? And sometimes it is very good to use pre-validated equipment. It makes it much faster, much more streamlined if we can do that. So if you are interested in getting your hands on any of those protocols, please either talk to us or put that link into your browser, and you should be able to to access them if you are a member or if you talk to us. But the planned next steps for Watervale at the moment are still looking at how we can develop additional protocols that could or should be developed. So at the moment, we're looking at membrane filtration and ultrafiltration, ozone, biological activated carbon, and dual media filtration. And we have a currently supporting Water RA project in that realm. So that's currently undergoing. But what is the future of Watervale? And as the custodians of Watervale, Water RA is seeking really to collaborate with stakeholders to realize the benefits of the investment that's been come before us, and also the Watervale resources. So in 2018, as an initial, we've started a community of interest and had a Watervale workshop. In 2020, we conducted a Watervale survey. What are the barriers to implementation and what are the options for the future? And these workshops, industry member workshops, have continued to today, and they were run with the industry members and also with regulatory and policy members of Water RA. The needs are still clear. So the needs are still water validation processes for all water sources: drinking water, recycled water, stormwater, groundwater, to protect public health and the environment. But we also want these protocols and through this process to support the AGWR, the ADWG, and the health-based targets and other guidelines and requirements. And this would consider, I mean, the need is there to have an independent endorsement of technologies and processes. And another need was still there, despite all the state regulatory differences and advances. We wanted a consistent approach between jurisdictions within Australia, and that was a very strong message in the workshops. So it would create a mechanism for the recognition of international validation or technology certification programs. And we heard from Chu how they use the EPA's testing methodology. Database and website would be created. There is a need for that. to provide access to Watervale and the protocols and any other relevant validation information. Also, we would like to add some of the different parameters to the protocol scheme, so including chemical contaminant removal as well as pathogens, and then identify and prioritize research that could support those protocols should research be needed to fill some of the knowledge gaps. Also, collaboration with internal stakeholders and international stakeholders and research is of really good value, because especially in some of the countries, they have developed those protocols, and why reinvent the world, but make it relevant for the Australian context. We want to maintain and update validation processes and knowledge, so there's an ongoing maintenance component here. But we also want to catalyze the training and competency programs for all stakeholders, and this includes the designers, the operators, the regulators, and the policymakers. So the key benefits through our workshops have shown that it's still the clarification and the harmonization of scientific and regulatory approaches and requirements at a national level, a nationally consistent and agreed process that is transparent and independent, and to create standardized protocols for validation, and new validation studies would be undertaken according to the developed protocol process. So this is still the key benefits that was identified through our key stakeholder workshops. But there were also key challenges to date, and this is answering some of the questions as to why has it taken so long. The ownership and administration and the ongoing management of the scheme has not been so clear. Who would take it over? Who would fund it? Funding is a big one. And also the governance. And we needed an agreement across many regulatory jurisdictions. So this was the original national validation framework. And as we have heard, that was the cornerstone product and outcome, a desired outcome of the Center of Excellence at the time. So we would have this national framework, we would have a national framework administrator, and that administrator would be in charge of all these different components of the scheme. So the question then was, why hasn't this been able to be implemented? Well, people ran out of resources, both time and money. Funding could not be secured, and we could not find a home for a national administrator. Nobody wanted to take this on. And also there was concern about the commercial business model proposed by WaterSecure at the time for the implementation. The state regulators were concerned about the national certification and the implications for state guidelines and approvals. So what impact would that have on their state-based approvals process? So through those workshops and through quite a bit of work, and that was led by Marty Hancock in particular, there has been a new proposed Watervale option put on the table, which has been endorsed by the regulators and the industry members. And it's a simplified scheme. It is still having most of the components of the original scheme embedded. However, there is now a Watervale administrator which who can coordinate all these groups, but there are now independent assessors and consultants, and the scheme proponents consist of consultants to undertake these roles internally and undergo the testing and the validation according to those protocols that are submitted. So it is a bit of at an arm's length from the national framework, and it is allowing the states to apply some of these protocols as they wish, but there will be standard protocols developed, and the Watervale administrator will have the oversight of how to do that. So what does the Watervale administrator do? His role or her role would be to coordinate the rule setting group and the development of the protocols and research, manage the website and resources, and provide training. So it is, in the true sense of the word, an administrator. However, it is also a role that can instigate new research and the desire and the identification of which new protocols needed to be developed. So the rule setting group is made up of state and territory regulators, industry representatives, and technical experts. And its role is to determine and publish national validation requirements for treatment technologies, but also, and more importantly, through that process, it will provide consistency and certainty in validation requirements. So the upshot of it is the administrator would be funded by stakeholders in the first instance, and these are the industry and the regulators. It is a key opportunity for everybody because funding a Watervale administrator as a matter of priority to get the program moving and started can be of real value. And we could run it as a one-year pilot project under the new framework and see how it goes, you know, and can get some learnings from that first year. This means that the collaboration between the administrator and regulator can start immediately, and the regulators can, in parallel, determine the role of independent assessors as we move along. And if it is successful, the one-year pilot project provides key learnings to form a solid basis for securing ongoing funding. So not all the eggs are put in one basket, and we can roll with it because there is no national funding available at this point in time. It also allows still for the potential of a future national framework administrator. It doesn't rule it out. And that national framework administrator can lead the national framework, which could be implemented at a later time. It's bigger complexity. And it can also lead a certification body, which could be implemented at a later time. So in summary, the key needs and opportunities for easily accessible, trustworthy, and nationally endorsed validation protocols remain at the fore for the regulators and utilities. And a framework endorsed in principle was by both the in-house and the water utilities. Several potential protocols are ready for development to be incorporated into the framework now. So once funding is secured, a Watervale administrator can be employed and start working on the implementation of the framework's components. So this is the roadmap moving forward. It's a bit colorful, but you know, coming from the handover in 2018, where NatWell and Watervale was transferred to Water RA. The framework was reviewed, several workshops were held, and then in 2021, it was really endorsed by everybody to move forward in a different fashion with the simplified framework. And so now we're thinking that if we can get some funding and run it as a project to really try a one pilot of the Watervale administrator, that would be an excellent opportunity to trial and move this program forward. And it would really only be like, you know, let's say a 0.4 to 0.6 FTE. And if we have 12 utility or 12 industry members contributing 5K each, it would be up and running. So then we could have it checked in a year later and see what worked and what didn't work and how we need to change it. And then we can determine how an ongoing funding scheme could be developed and also develop the framework fully to drive the new protocol development and assisting utilities and regulators in a more streamlined fashion and just getting the ball rolling through this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. That was excellent, and I absolutely love the pitch at the end for $5 grand from all of us. So it doesn't seem too unreasonable. So, Kathy, can you get your presentation up and ready? Kathy Northcote is a chartered chemical engineer with over 25 years experience, mainly in the water sector. She's currently R&D manager for Veolia, Australia and New Zealand, brings a wealth of experience in water, wastewater, recycling, water technologies, water quality risk management and training to this role. In addition to her industry experience, she has a strong background in research. She's published numerous publications in the area of contaminated site management, advanced water treatment, recycling technologies, water quality risk management, and technical training and development. So over to Kathy.
Thanks, Mark. So what I'm going to talk about today is a bit of an extension of what Jacqueline was referring to, which is the looking towards the future and where could Watervale go. So I just want to emphasize that this is a kind of a thought bubble, this presentation. There has been a substantial amount of research done in this area, but there are no protocols as it stands right now for chemical risk management, for water recycling, that look anything like a Watervale protocol that we would see today for pathogen risk management. The idea of addressing both combined chemical and pathogen risks in water recycling schemes is not new. In fact, I noted that Stephen Gray is in today's members circle, and he actually led the Robust Recycling Project, which was funded by the Water Recycling Centre of Excellence. And that project actually developed a bit of a combined chemical pathogen risk management framework for an advanced water recycling plant. And so a lot of the concepts from that original project were drawn upon to develop this, this concept of a Watervale style protocol for chemical risks, which I'll present today. I just also want to mention that the validation study that I'll talk about in my presentation was actually done by a PhD student at the University of Melbourne, Hong Xiaopeng, who was actually supervised by Professor Peter Scales. Okay, so we're going to talk about a Watervale protocol approach to address chemical risks in water recycling. We'll start off with what keeps us awake at night with regards to chemicals of emerging concern. We know that both pathogens and chemicals are critical risks to water quality, public health, and the environment. We know that different classes of pathogens and chemicals can be monitored by routine sampling and analysis, but that is costly and it takes time. Luckily, we have things like Watervale and the health-based targets for drinking and recycled water that allow us to categorize pathogen risks into a small number of categories, and then we can place appropriate risk mitigation measures against those particular pathogen categories. You compare that to chemicals, where there's over 85,000 chemicals listed in common use. We only routinely measure about 1,500 typically, and there's tens of millions of chemicals that are currently registered and characterized in less common use, but there's more chemicals being registered every day. Our typical approach is a multi-barrier treatment system that we can use to reliably remove contaminants, but the challenge for a treatment barrier selection is ability to directly and continuously measure the level of contaminant removal. So for pathogen risks, for many years, I think all of us know and love the critical control point approach. And that's where a treatment barrier is operated within a specified range and validated to claim something called a log removal or an LRV credit. It's been demonstrated in drinking water. There was a health-based targets manual, which describes in pretty good detail around how you can assign log reduction credits for treatment barriers for pathogens. And then there's the Watervale protocols, which Jacqueline talked about, the 5 main protocols that are currently available and can be used today. So whilst we've got this well-established critical control point concept for pathogen control, we've got the Watervale protocols. We've got log reduction values for treatment barriers. We can also use surrogate measures. So we're not testing for pathogens in real time using online monitoring. We're using surrogate measures that we can use as a surrogate to the presence or absence of that particular pathogen. This approach significantly reduces the need for regular daily compliance testing, because you can actually have barrier integrity and compliance validation linked. So with regards to pathogen validation, the Watervale protocols use the concept of these 9 elements. And so they start from element 1, which is where you identify mechanisms of pathogen removal across a treatment barrier. Then you identify your target pathogens or surrogates that you're going to use. Then you look at critical factors that affect the efficacy of treatment of a particular treatment barrier. You look at operational monitoring parameters. You come up with a validation methodology. You have a method to collect and analyze your validation and verification data. You look at your method to determine critical limits and control strategies. you do a method to determine log reduction values within a critical limit, and then you've got your triggers for revalidation of your process. So this chemical risk framework that I'm going to talk about today relies very, very heavily on this concept of the 9 elements of Watervale. So we've got these Watervale protocols. We've got a consistent standardized approach to developing a Watervale protocol. Fantastic for pathogens, but what are we doing about chemicals? The problems with chemicals, as I've mentioned previously, is there's over 85,000 in common use and tens of millions that are up there registered on databases and things like that. How do we use a Watervale approach to manage chemical risks as clearly and consistently as we can do for pathogen risks? So let's focus on, in today's presentation, I'm just going to focus on the first 5 elements of Watervale. The reason for that is the first 5 elements are the ones that are more or less you can apply consistently based on a treatment barrier or a treatment barrier selection, whereas the following 4 elements tend to be more site or scheme specific. So that's why I'm sort of going just with the first 5 elements. So the first 5 elements are the mechanisms of pathogen removal, target pathogen surrogates, factors that affect efficacy of treatment, operational monitoring parameters, and your validation method. Now, we did an analysis where we compared the requirements for those Watervale elements for pathogens, and then we've done a comparison against what we would need for this hypothetical chemical protocol using the Watervale approach. So what we actually found was that the mechanisms of pathogen removal, and we're using the reverse osmosis example. So that we're taking the reverse osmosis nanofiltration Watervale protocol, but we're applying it to chemicals this time. What we found was that they're essentially the same mechanisms of removal for both pathogen removal and for chemical removal. The only difference is probably what happens with chemicals with regards to the adsorption diffusion mechanism of removal is a little bit different. In terms of your target or target compounds or your surrogates, generally for pathogens, what you do is you pick your smallest pathogen. In the case of reverse osmosis virus, the most difficult to treat, and that's usually your target in terms of establishing your critical limits. For chemicals, what we actually did was we found a limited number of chemical characteristics that we could use to establish what a target chemical might look like. Factors that affect the efficacy of treatment, what we actually found was they're essentially the same, regardless of whether it's pathogens or chemicals. The performance factors for a treatment process, those things that influence the performance of the treatment process are the same for pathogens and chemicals. Similarly, for the operational monitoring parameters, we found a number of your standard operational monitoring techniques that you would use can be used just as effectively for chemicals as pathogens. And then your validation method is essentially the same. It involves a challenge test using a target or a target chemical class. And then you assign a credible log reduction value for chemicals based on some sort of surrogate measure for integrity. And it sounds like somebody's got their microphone on. I want to talk.
If I could just jump in briefly, Kathy, and ask whoever has their microphone on to please mute it. They obviously haven't heard me because they're still talking.
Yeah, I think I can just talk over them. I talk loud enough. So anyway, I want to talk about a specific validation trial that we did on a Veolia operated Class A recycled plant and carrying through this idea of using the reverse osmosis validation protocol and seeing if we can equally apply it to chemicals as that protocol is written for pathogens currently. What we did was a one-off sampling campaign across this entire Class A water recycling plant. We did 7 sampling points across the entire process, and that has allowed us to establish the chemical profile across that entire process. Then we did a 6-week campaign where we looked at pre and post RO, and we did an analytical testing to perform as per a list of analytical methods. Okay, So I'm going to talk about these 5 elements, first 5 elements of the Watervale protocol in the context of chemicals, and give you some a bit of an overview of our findings for this particular validation trial on this Class A water recycling plant. So as I mentioned previously, for the mechanisms of chemical removal, we established that the 3 main mechanisms of removal are the same for pathogens as they are for chemicals. So what we found, it was size exclusion, charge repulsion, and the adsorption and diffusion effects on the membrane. The key one being that adsorption has more of a detrimental rejection mechanism. So we actually don't want chemicals to adsorb to the surface of the membrane, because that actually facilitates transfer of chemicals through the membrane. And so the second element, which is establishing target chemicals or surrogates. So during our sampling campaign, we were able to establish certain chemical characteristics that related to whether or not a chemical was detected after the reverse osmosis unit. And so this table here shows which particular classes of chemicals, based on those chemical characteristics, we actually detected after the water had passed through the RO system. And we were able to link them back to the key removal mechanisms. In terms of the element number 3, which are the factors that affect the efficacy of treatment, I mentioned earlier that what we found in the study was that basically the performance parameters that they've established for pathogen removal, we've determined are essentially the same for chemical removal. And what I've got here is a table taken directly out of the current pathogen protocol, Watervale protocol for reverse osmosis and nanofiltration. And it shows the impact of influencing factor on the log reduction using various surrogate measures and membrane integrity indicators. And what you'll notice from this table, which is out of the current protocol, is that most of our membrane integrity indicators and surrogates that are recommended for pathogens are actually chemical ones, probably with the exception of the MS2 phage one. So if it's going to work effectively for pathogens, and then we're going to look at applying it for a chemical risk management framework, if it's already a chemical method, it kind of by logic suggests that it's going to be effective at determining whether or not you can measure the removal ability of a chemical across the membrane. So moving on to the 4th element, which is operational monitoring parameters. We tested a number of different operational monitoring parameters in addition to the ones that are on this slide. However, what we did find was that conductivity had a really, really good correlation with chemical removal and a high level of accuracy. So we were 95 to 97% basically with the level of accuracy of the conductivity as a surrogate measure to chemical removal was 95 to 97% of the actual value, which means that we could reliably use conductivity as a continuous online measure to determine our levels of chemical removal across the reverse osmosis membrane. As a backup, we actually did quite a bit of work around the bioassay, and we established that you can actually use the bioassay as a cheap, quick, reliable, and quite accurate means of doing a broad chemical screen. So actually looking at a broad range of chemicals and chemical classes quite quickly as a backup to that conductivity measurement. To determine whether or not you're getting those chemical removals. And then going on to element number 5, which is the validation method. What I've got here is a table that was put forward in Hongjiao Pang's thesis, where she actually established 10 chemical classes. Now, I did mention 85,000 chemicals in common use, tens of millions of chemicals that are registered and described. We took those, however, tens of millions of chemicals down to 10 chemical classes. And that's the worst case scenario, because in actual fact, depending on what your feed water profile is and your how much detail you want to go into in terms of your log reduction targets, you could actually get that down to about 4 or 5 chemicals or target chemicals that you may need to use to challenge test to validate your RO membrane. So for example, you might decide that you're only going to do a challenge test for class 3 chemicals, which means that it will capture the class 1 and 2 chemicals as well. So you only need to do one challenge test with one target chemical for those 3 chemical classes, that sort of thing. So I'll talk about that quickly in this next slide. So to give you an example, and these are not the definitive, as I said, you would basically pick the chemicals that you want to as target chemicals based on your feed water quality profile, based on your regulatory requirements in your jurisdiction, and based on how many target chemicals, like what level of detail you want to break down to in terms of the chemical classes. But just to give you an idea, is like for a class 3 chemical, we detected carbamazepine, and I apologize because I'm not a chemist, I probably mispronounce all this stuff terribly. It's in the right range for a class 3 chemical. We know that we should be able to claim a log reduction value of greater than 1. It is a bit too close to the upper limit of that class, so you might look around for some other chemical that you might want to use. For a class 4 chemical, I'm not even going to pronounce that chemical, but anyway, we found one which was detected, and it could actually be used as a challenge agent for reverse osmosis membranes for that class. For class 7, we determined caffeine seemed to be a really effective challenge agent for class 7, and I think that actually captures another couple of classes as well. I think it's class 8 as well. Class 9, either sodium or chloride makes for a suitable challenge agent. And class 10, it would be either boron or ammonia probably at the correct pH, and you know, regulators sometimes would frown on the idea of using boron as a challenge agent, so it might actually be ammonia. So in conclusion, can we actually establish chemical protocols along the lines of the Watervale pathogen protocols? Yes, we can. We've actually drafted a proposed validation protocol for an ozone barrier. I've just gone through the proposed validation concept for the RO barrier. It's also been looked into to come up with an adsorption protocol, and it's sort of partially developed. There's still more research that's needed to finalize that, but it's some of the way there. It appears to be effective in improving chemical risk mitigation in water quality management. Even though it's typically associated with pathogen risk management, we think that it could be applied to chemicals, even though it hasn't yet been applied to date. And it provides an opportunity for the adoption of this Watervale approach for the design and implementation of treatment barriers, so that we can better address the risk of chemical contamination. And just to reiterate that the validation trial work was part of Hong Zhao's thesis, and it was supervised by Professor Peter Scales. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathy. Excellent presentation, and gives us all a little additional angle to think about from Watervale. We didn't get a lot of questions through sent by the chat line, but there was one that I was particularly interested in, was, and I see Jacqueline has answered that. That was from Jamila Hull. Jacqueline, do you want to just go into that in detail for everybody rather than have us read it? The relationship with the regulators, I think, is key to what we're all talking about here.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll put a few bullet points in as an answer, but we realized very early on that this is a key a key requirement for this. And this was also a key stumbling block initially for it to not get the, I guess, the running on the ground initially, because it was too complex. And then also the state regulators were worried about what implications there would be if there was a nationally endorsed certification scheme. So hence the new kind of framework takes away the pressure a bit. And so we want to start with baby steps and kind of get to that point. So I think it is still an option, like I said, get a national framework up. But initially we're doing a smaller version of this. And through that process, the rule setting group is comprised of state and territory regulators, industry reps, and experts. And so through that process, we're hoping that we can come to the, it's an endorsement pathway. So it's a co-design of those, so to speak. But they have actually expressed a real need for that to continue. So.
Yeah, excellent. I think we all would appreciate that the regulators have their own positions to, or their own communities to protect, and they like to do it in, in whatever way they can, and we're challenging that to some extent. There was a question from Greg Clayton. Greg, are you still here? That was who owns the
Yep, still here.
AGW? Yeah, Greg, go for it.
Yeah, great question, Greg, and I'm happy to have a stab at answering it for you. As you're probably aware, the original documents, the original AGWR documents were endorsed and owned by various ministerial councils, most of them which don't exist anymore. For example, the National Resource Management Ministerial Council. Both Phase 1 and Phase 2 guidelines sit under what was the then National Water Quality Management Strategy, which is unfortunately a largely ignored strategy. Still sits online and is administered at the moment by the Commonwealth Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment, or DOR. So I guess at the moment, the only document that's been actively reviewed is the Phase 1 framework guideline document, which started off being reviewed by NHealth and their Drinking Water Regulator Committee, but that then shifted across to NHMRC and their Water Quality Advisory Committee, or QAC, to finalise. And I believe the finalisation of the Phase 1 updates on the current work plan for QAC. So I don't know if that helps answer your question, Greg. It's very complex, and it's sort of fallen a little bit through the gaps because I guess it began to rain, and then unfortunately recycled water became a bit of a lesser order issue.
Okay, thank you for that, David. Hopefully that answers the question. We have a bunch of questions for Chu around Googong. I might just sort of run through what people are asking. Things like what's the recycled water used for? What sort of volume uptake are you seeing? Are people actually using the water? And I'll come back with a couple of questions that the host gets to ask when you've addressed those.
Okay, cool. So the recycled water is being used for dual retake scheme. So typically that include the toilet flushing and also irrigation. So irrigation, there's two levels: the household level, irrigation of the garden, and then at the council level, which is irrigation of the park. So internal uptake, I think the public are embracing it. They understand Googong is an inland town, and water resiliency is a key part of it. So I think there's a couple of other people here who know the scheme. As far as I know, there is no objection to the use of recycled water. It's quite well embraced by the community. There's also a question about the charges of the recycled water. versus portable from Stephen. So internal charges, I don't have the exact figure again, but I do know the recycled water, just like any other scheme, they are cheaper than portable water. I think it's about 80% of the price, but I can confirm later on.
And just a question on the validation of the MBR. Was the Watervale protocol used by the regulator to come up with a validation procedure? And you mentioned that the CCP is turbidity. What turbidity have you settled on?
So the first question, when we were selecting the membrane technology, it was back in 2013. So at that time, the most probably the best validation guideline is the guideline from Victoria. The Watervale protocol, I'm actually not sure whether it's available at the time. So going back to the Victoria guideline published by HAL, they recommended the use of the US EPA guideline, which was the guideline that we settled on in terms of using it for this project. Maybe Jackie can comment on whether the Watervale protocol is based on the US EPA guideline are totally different. I'm not so sure about that. But the US EPA guideline was the one that was adopted for the basis. Jackie, any comment?
Yeah, so firstly, it is available on our website. And it does, your question of whether or not it was adopted.
It was based on US EPA guideline.
US EPA guideline. So it's based on the validation objectives of the the NRM Ministerial Council. But look, I have to, I'm sorry, I don't actually, no, maybe Cassie knows because she's, I don't, hold on. There are some references in the protocol, and there are some of them are actually from Australia that have used some of these validation protocols. I think some, yeah. So I, sorry, I can't actually answer that.
I'm pretty sure, Stu, that when they were put together, they grabbed hold of all the international available guidance, and that was incorporated into the protocol. So there was very little sort of new original work done in Australia. It was mainly about pulling together international stuff. The only reason I know any of this is that I was, one of the other hats I wore at one point was chair of the Protocol Development Committee under Water Secure. But yeah, that they were all based on international studies. But one of the interesting things, though, is that those validation protocols were then so well regarded that California used them as the basis of a lot of their thinking around potable reuse.
Sure.
Yeah. And also, I just found it. So yeah, of course, David is correct. US EPA 2005 membrane filtration guidance manual. So, and I think we do know that those were, the US EPA's guidance were often used as a basis for some of those.
All right. So shoot your questions through by text if you have any more. We're not going to let Kathy get away without getting her involved in some questions. So, Kathy, where can you see the need for chemicals to be controlled using a Watervale or similar protocol?
I think the obvious one, particularly in the Australian context, is around things like PFAS. So, I mean, everybody mentions PFAS and everybody jumps under the desk in fright. And we already have certain drinking water supplies around the country that are starting to become compromised by the presence of PFAS being detected in their source water supplies. So I think an easy starting point would be around some of those chemicals of emerging concern that are really front and center in regulators' minds. If we had a chemical protocol already to go that you could put under the nose of the regulator and say, we've got these treatment barriers, there's a chemical protocol that says that we can get this level of log reduction under these operational conditions, so we're all good to go. I think that would make life a lot easier, both for scheme operators as well as regulators in terms of sign-off.
Stephen Gray, do you want to jump in and talk about NDMA?
It was really just a question about what the work you've done so far and how much additional work you might think you might need to do, Kathy. We know with NDMA that can get rejected by RO membranes, but it does vary from site to site, and fouling plays a big issue on that. So have you just done the demonstration at one site, and is there a need to roll that out and look at how universal the relationships are?
So you're right, Stephen. It was basically a bit of a coalition of the willing that we were able to pull together the people and the funding and the support to trial this reverse osmosis concept at one site. The scientific literature and everything that was the body of knowledge that was built up to come up with the concept is sound, but I think, yeah, it would warrant us wanting to try this out at a few different sites under different feed water quality profiles for us to say, yes, this can definitely remove these chemicals in these classes to the log reduction values that we think we can claim.
Greg Clayton, you're asking about the Watervale administrator. So perhaps you can pose that question to Jacqueline, and I'll add a bit to that on why that might be needed at this early stage.
Okay. So the answer to that is actually quite simple. If you have an implementation scheme and no resourcing, it is a hollow proposition. So by getting a very simple first step done, a Watervale administrator with kind of a limited funding proposal, I think you can get the ball rolling. You can actually implement some things. You can generate the development of protocols, which also have to be developed by, different people. But the Watervale administrator, like a central point to one ring to rule them all at the moment, is quite important and probably kind of a simple proposition. So if we can get it going, we can do a 1-year pilot program. We can run it like a project that is funded by our stakeholders, and then actually really make sure we take the learnings, especially what needs to be done to keep this funding into the future. So we have to bring the regulators fully on board at the very beginning, and all the industry members, and also the the experts in the field.
Greg, does that cover your question as well?
Oh, thanks, Mark. Part of my question was also the extent to which the Commonwealth agencies, the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment, are being involved in this discussion, in that they have leadership of Australian water policy, and also have done certain things in the past under the National Water Quality Strategy, National Water Quality Management Strategy, through one of their subcommittees on national water quality policy. So I also had the question about the extent of conversations that have been held with those sorts of people who have that Commonwealth leadership role and also look after the National Water Reform Committee.
Can I pop this question to David? Yeah, thank you. In the first instance, and then I can take on.
Gee, how long we got? It's a very tortuous process. I think, as you're probably well aware, Greg, constitutionally water sits with the states, not the Commonwealth. So the Commonwealth only ever acts as a coordinating body for national guidance. So And as a previous managing director that I reported to said, water tends to be an A or Z issue. So when there's droughts, it's an A issue, and when there's rains, it's a Z issue. And at the moment, it's probably towards the Z end of the alphabet, where there isn't sort of a huge driver for water recycling. If we were to go back into a drop, well, look over the horizon and all the predictions around climate change's impact on Australia, you think we'd be getting our house in order earlier rather than later. So I think there is a need for national coordination. And I know there's answers far broader than what you were probably looking for, but until we get a bit of leadership around the National Water Quality Management Strategy and how that's going to inform state-based policy, I think we're going to be knocking on a lot of doors and not getting a lot of response. So that's not to say we can't try, but there doesn't seem to be an appetite really to get down into urban water reform. There's a lot around water trading and sort of I guess natural water systems, but if you go down to urban water reform, that still tends to sit with state governments.
Yeah, I think I would say, David, isn't that right? I mean, this has been tried to get it to the national level with the Watervale, and it has not it has not been falling on fertile ground, and hence we had to actually change the whole scheme and start with a different approach altogether, so to get it moving. And sometimes if you start small and move and get a cohort that is really supportive of it, that can talk to the higher ups, I mean, that's why the whole approach has been turned around a bit.
Okay, well, I'll open the floor for a question or two more. We've got about 4 minutes left on our scheduled time. Would anybody like to stick their hands up, or will we wrap it up? And thank you all for coming. I think the silence, I see Stephen Gray's unmuted. Have you got something there?
Oh, no.
Right. Okay, all right. Thank you everybody for coming. Thank you for the time and effort that our speakers have put in. I think they've done a fabulous job, and putting things together like this, people, dedicate a lot of hours to share their knowledge, and I think we should all be very appreciative of that. And I'd just like to say thank you for everybody who came along and listened. We sort of peaked at about 71 participants. We're down to 52 now, so I think that's probably not a bad retention rate for these sort of events. Yeah, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.